Yeah, it's called Conversations with Jeff, not Screaming Matches.
Yeah, you and I do not agree on Calvinism. But look how nice we are to each other.
I think it's going to really shock a lot of people, thrill a lot of people. A lot of people are going to have to do some soul searching.
It's like, you know what? What are you doing? You're spending all your time trying to destroy another Christian day because you don't understand what's going on, when you should be out there winning people for Jesus.
Right.
Thank you for the job you're doing. Thanks for being willing to address these kind of issues. They're vital to the church.
I feel sorry for what's coming your way, but God bless you, man. It's a good, healthy conversation, and let's keep growing together in the Lord.
People won't change unless they hear the truth, though. And so we need to know the truth, speak the truth, and then the last one I would say is that we need to stay in the truth, no matter what the consequences are.
Okay, welcome to today's episode of Conversations with Jeff. Really excited to have you guys all joining us here today. Before we get started with today's show, just wanted to let you guys know about our membership program that we do have here at the GK. You get exclusive access to some really cool perks like the Destroy Social Justice Conference that we put on, the recording of that. You get 30% off over in the GK store, and a lot of other really cool added perks and that sort of thing. Go to gatekeepersonline.com/plugged-in for more information on that. Really excited about today's guest. We've got Dr. Andy Woods joining us. I believe this is your third time now on Conversations with Jeff, but welcome back, and glad we can sit down today.
Yeah, that means I should be granted tenure, I guess.
I think so. I think that's technically the rule here. So, but yeah, I'm really glad to have you back on. And I feel like, too, there's so much going on in the world that, as Christians, it's like we're trying to figure out, okay, what do we actually do? Because I feel like everything is getting blurred together, and it's getting harder and harder to kind of discern what's reality and what's true and what's not.
Well, I feel that way, too. I feel like we've been hit with three crises. The first is, and these are not just little things. These are like the biggest things that have ever happened in my lifetime. COVID-19 and all the implications there. The second is all of these riots, that have broken out all over the country. And, people not really respecting the sovereignty of the United States and wanting to have their own little whatever, in Seattle, their own country, I guess. I don't think they would have done that if Ronald Reagan was the president, but. And then the third thing is a Supreme Court that really just could care less about the Constitution and just lost the culture war for us, a week ago. So America's been hit with three biggies, we could put it that way.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the interesting things too about it is seeing how the church has really responded to like the coronavirus crisis, the Black Lives Matter, craziness that's going on. And even the Supreme Court to a certain degree, but I know even with the coronavirus thing, it's been interesting seeing how a lot of these prominent pastors have been responding, and some are going hardcore, interpretation of Romans 13, like, well, we have to submit no matter what they say, and then the question is, which form of the government do we submit to? Do we submit to Trump? Do we submit to the local government? All that kind of stuff. How do we decipher even just like Romans 13 when the government's telling us to do one thing, and we're like, okay, who do we even submit to?
Well, with this current crop of evangelical leaders, I don't think if they had been alive during the time of the American Revolution, I don't think we would have had an American Revolution, let alone won the American Revolution. So I don't know. It's just a product of the last century of humanistic propaganda. The humanists told us we're going to take over the public schools. And his name was Potter. I think his last name was Potter. Said, we're going to take over the public schools. And we're going to use the public schools to indoctrinate the next generation into humanism, away from biblical theism. And there's not a thing you can do to stop it, because once we take control of the public schools, then what can the theistic Sunday school teachers meeting an hour a week, do to stem the tide of all week long humanistic indoctrination? And he made that statement in 1932. And if there's anything we don't learn from history, is we don't really learn to take people seriously when they come out and say stuff like that. What if we had taken seriously Mein Kampf? I mean, a lot of lives could have been saved. So anyway, this has been going on for a long time. And so now, as the Bible says, you've sown to the wind. Now you're reaping the whirlwind. We have a whole generation right now that does not understand freedom. They don't understand inalienable rights, and they just are almost cheering, it almost looks like, to give up one right after the other. And this is happening, within evangelical circles. And so it's just tragic to see what's taking place.
Yeah, well, I know we've talked about guys like John MacArthur in previous shows, oftentimes dealing with like Calvinism and Lordship Salvation and all that kind of stuff. But I know he kind of made news with what he was saying in his submission via Romans 13 to the government of, when President Trump came out and encouraged all the churches to open back up. Grace announced, okay, we're going to open up on Sunday, and then the next day on Saturday, they're like, well, the local government said no, so we're not going to open up, and they were kind of going back and forth on that, and so then now we're even out here in California, we've got a bunch of churches still not meeting because of all the different rules and regulations. So it's been 4 months of not meeting for church. So it's like, do we submit under this kind of stuff? Do we not? Like, what are we actually supposed to do?
Well, with the John MacArthur thing, here you have a president that did something that I've never seen in my lifetime, where he just stood in the gap for the churches. And he basically, you remember the speech, he said, go back to church next Sunday. And the Constitution, makes the federal government the supreme law of the land. And so I was thrilled, and we went back to church at our church. We still have to operate by certain guidelines, put out by local government. But, we went back to church, and we were happy to do it. And I was just shocked that the rest of the country didn't. And I was just sort of shocked, like a big church and a big name like John MacArthur would acquiesce to some puny local official. When the president of the United States, the leader of the United States said, go back to church. So I don't know. It's almost like they're looking for an excuse, not to go back to church. And if everybody wants a sign, if that wasn't a sign from God to go back to church, where the president says, go back to church, I don't know what is. And, that's an interesting question about civil disobedience. Was John MacArthur engaging in civil disobedience when he disobeyed Trump? If he wants to play the civil disobedience card, we can play that two ways. So I don't know. The whole thing is just mystifying to me. And we just have if this generation had been alive at the time of the American Revolution, there wouldn't have been one, let alone would we have been victorious in it, because the teachings. And I have a book, looking over there to my left on my bookshelf. It's about 1,000 pages, and it's only volume 1. And the title of it is Patriotic Sermons from the Colonial Clergy. And those guys were teaching politics and freedom and inalienable rights. In fact, I would argue, and Calvin Coolidge said this, he said, the people that put together our Constitution and Declaration of Independence, like Thomas Jefferson, got their whole idea from listening to sermons in the colonial era. Because I've had people come to my church and kind of complain that I teach too much on politics. And I usually just show them a copy of that book. And I show them that the stuff I say is pretty mild, compared to what they were saying back in the day. And so we don't have that today from our pulpit. We have this kind of limp limp-wristed, sort of weak-kneed, bow to government at the slightest resistance that they send our direction. So if I've got to choose between the president and some wimpy local person, I'm going to acquiesce to the local person on the grounds of Romans 13, when in reality, they're actually breaking Romans 13 because they're disobeying the highest law of the land. Anyway, those are my random thoughts.
Yeah. Well, so I think one of the debates that's going on within Christianity right now is this idea of, should the church be fighting for freedom and liberty? Should the church be fighting for like constitutional rights? I grew up in the very John MacArthur crowd and all that kind of stuff, where it was, we don't fight for our rights, and it was almost this mentality of, we should welcome communist China type things because the church in China is flourishing. And, and so then they look down on people that are like, no, we got to fight for our rights, fight for our freedom, all that kind of stuff. How do we wade those waters of, do we get involved in politics? Do we fight for our rights, our constitutional rights, that sort of thing? Or do we just say, put our hands up and just say, nope, bring on the persecution. This is how we, further the church.
Well, from those colonial sermons, our forebears, put into print the idea of unalienable rights or inalienable rights. And if you look at the etymology of that, alienable, you'll see the word lien in there. Like if I have a lien against your property, you really don't own the property. I own the property. And if you sell it, the proceeds go to me. So when they said inalienable rights, what they're saying is rights without a lien, attached to them, because they come from God. And because our forebears were preaching this, and our founding fathers were listening, they put it into the force of the Declaration of Independence, later the Constitution, later the Bill of Rights. And so that is our heritage in America. We have rights that have no lien attached to them because they come from God. And because they come from God, man cannot take them away. So I think it was John Adams, that talked about how there is no, because our rights come from God, they come from the great, what he called the super legislature in the sky, a divine super legislature that man can't take away. So I'm sorry, but those rights are ours regardless of any pandemic or plandemic or pandemonium or plandemonium. They didn't say, okay, these rights are yours unless we have a major disease or catastrophe. So, I get the fact that this is new to us medically and everybody's afraid of, it being contagious, and we have to pay attention to the science available. But we also have to understand that no government entity has a right to take away what we have. And, this idea that I'm just going to submit to unjust tyranny on account of Romans 13, to me, that's a violation of Romans 13 because you're disobeying the Declaration of Independence, which tells us that our rights come from God. And as you know, once government takes a right away, they rarely do they ever, it's almost slim to none, and slim just left town, so to speak, that you'll ever get that right back. So I think we ought to work with the science as much as we can, but we ought to stand up for our unalienable rights as part of our heritage. That, by the way, comes to us from the Bible. It's my thinking on it, anyway.
Yeah. Well, and I think one of the other issues, and you had mentioned it too in the very beginning, was all of this, the Black Lives Matter, riots and protesting and all that kind of stuff that's going on. And and again, we're seeing a lot of evangelical leaders that seem to be, lending credibility and their support to Black Lives Matter and all of that. What's your kind of position on all of that? Are the protests valid? Are they not? Is Black Lives Matter, a valid thing to be supporting?
Well, Black Lives Matter is a communist group, and I just read something today where there was an interview with one of the leaders. You probably saw the headline, same headline I saw, that they're acknowledging that they're communists, they're Marxist. I mean, we even knew before that George Soros, gave and gives a sizable amount of money to Black Lives Matter. We know that Black Lives Matter is anti the modern state of Israel. So, I mean, you want to, what does the Bible say? Come out from among them and be ye separate. I mean, you get a pastor that wants to cooperate with the Black Lives Matter agenda. You're cooperating with a communist, Marxist, anti-God, anti-Jew, anti-Israel perspective, and that whole mindset makes zero sense to me at all. Why anybody that claims to be a biblicist in any sense would cooperate with Black Lives Matter? And the premise of the whole thing is America is structurally racist, which it is not. Heather McDonald has all the statistics about all the police departments and how there's maybe bad actors, just like you have them anywhere, and individual racists, just like you have them anywhere. That doesn't mean everything is structurally biased or racially biased from top to bottom. Yet that's the argument that they're making. They're basically saying burn down the American plantation because the whole thing is structurally racist from its core. And of course, there's sins in American history related to race, and I don't know of any country that has done more to atone for those sins than the United States. I mean, you look at all of the Union white lives that were lost in the Civil War. I Googled that once. The number is about 300,000 Union white lives lost in the Civil War to eradicate slavery. You look at Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, and then you look at how we changed our Constitution lawfully through the amendment process, which isn't easy to do. 3 times. You've got the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. And then when the Jim Crow situation continued, we passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, bipartisan. And then Lyndon Johnson's Great Society, has transferred probably about $5 trillion from one race to another. And some of the thinking on that might be a little fuzzy, but the reality of the situation is when you look at history, there isn't a country that's done more to fix any, racist sins of its past than the United States. And it's like Black Lives Matter. They're still fighting the Civil War. They're acting like we're all, that the country is still structurally racist. And so their idea is just burn the whole thing down, burn down the American plantation. Brandon House and myself did a couple of radio shows on that, and that document we believe was written by Bill Ayers, the Weather Underground terrorist. So that's Black Lives Matter for you, and why someone that's an evangelical would want to cooperate with that mindset on so many different fronts. It's a mystery to me. Yeah. Come out from among them and be ye separate. Don't be unequally yoked. Sorry for filibustering there.
No, it was really interesting because I saw a video by, I think it was Matt Chandler, and he was talking about a lot of this, and he was saying that these riots and us needing to support Black Lives Matter as our inheritance for our white privilege that have gone on over the years, and just this weird kind of like mentality and justification for supporting the protests and the riots and that sort of thing. Now, I mean, is this something where it's like, as Christians, we should be countering and saying, like, no, the system is not systemically racist? Do we acknowledge, the stories and the experiences that people are trying to share and things like that? How do we do this on, let's say, more of a personal level with brothers and sisters in Christ that may be Black that are supporting Black Lives Matter?
Well, I think, when you tell a Black person that you can never get ahead because there's an invisible force holding you down, despite the fact that we elected Obama 2 times in this country. I mean, why would we elect a Black man president, duly elected, if this is a systemically racist country? Oprah Winfrey is a billionaire, and how could that have happened in a systemically racist country? And I think what we need to tell people, particularly racial minorities, particularly Christian racial minorities, is this is the freest, most independent a country, most prosperous country that you could ever be involved in, and you could go right to the top, depending on your work ethic and your talents, and there's absolutely nothing holding you back. And so if you give people that message, then they assert themselves. But when you tell them there's some kind of invisible force holding them back, and no matter what they do, they're always going to be held back, then why try? And I think that is destructive to people. And so when Matt Chandler and all these people get involved with this issue, I think what he's doing is he's doing a lot more harm, a lot more damage than he is good. Because think about it, if the man is always the white business owner or whoever is always holding you down, there's no need to even try. But there are there's a lot of very articulate black people like Candace Owens and Larry Elder. One of my heroes in the legal world is Clarence Thomas. We can throw into the mix Walter Williams, Thomas Sowell. I mean, any number of them. There's a ton of them out there who would say the exact same thing I'm saying.
Yeah.
But the problem is when we say it, they don't listen to us because they think we're giving a white person's perspective, and we don't really understand their plight. But when they say it, it's different, and I think that's why conservative blacks, are so hated. But I think their message is what needs to be heard. I don't know. So
yeah. Well, and I think too, like a distinction when it comes to a lot of this is that where a lot of these riots are happening, where a lot of the claimed injustice is being claimed is in these leftist cities and leftist states like California and New York and Seattle and Chicago and all these places. And so if there is systemic oppression, if there is systemic racism, it seems to me like it's coming from the leftist, big government, overbearing regulations and laws and all that kind of stuff that's making it more difficult to get out of poverty than it is in the free places like let's say like a Texas or something like that, where you don't have as many regulations and that sort of thing. So that is an interesting perspective to look at too.
Well, when this whole George Floyd thing hit, and let's come out on the record, we all agree that there was a terrible injustice perpetrated against that man, and the people that were involved in that, need to be prosecuted to the full extent of the law. Everybody agrees with that.
Right.
The problem is they're using this as a basis to say all of America is that way. And that's their basis for burning down the American plantation and replacing it with something else. And that's where they're fitting into the hands of Marxists. I mean, Marxists have always taught that, haven't they? That one group is exploiting another group. What did Karl Marx say? Workers of the world unite. You have nothing to lose but your chains. This is how they've toppled, Saul Alinsky taught this. That's how you topple any civilization you want to replace with a Marxist paradigm, is you go into that society and you find an existing tension and you rub it raw. And you make it worse than it is. And that's where America is vulnerable, because America has had this issue with race, in the past. And so there's this ongoing resentment. And so, basically they're told that one class, the white people, are exploiting another class, the black people. And so rise up and demand reparations, which is a code word for wealth redistribution. And so, evangelicals that promote that are really just becoming nothing more than useful idiots, for the Marxist revolution. But what I was going to say is when this whole George Floyd thing hit, the immediate news that I received, I was given the impression that it was white Christian Republicans, that did this to George Floyd. Well, then you look at the facts and you see that this happened in a Democrat district, Democrat city council, Democrat state. And so, if they're fighting racial exploitation and all of these kinds of things, they really should be fighting the Democratic Party. And by the way, as you know, the Democratic Party is the party of the Ku Klux Klan. The Republican Party is the party of Lincoln. So everybody's got their, if you want to burn down the American plantation, you want to destroy all vestiges of racism, then maybe we should start talking about the Democratic Party. So everybody's history is lopsided. And, really what's happening is they want to use this as an excuse to say the whole country is this way. So let's destroy it and replace it with something else. And that's where they're becoming useful idiots for Marxists.
Yeah.
Who have pursued this narrative in other cultures, for a long time.
Yeah, well, and it really does seem like the left really, obviously they've got the mainstream media, so they're able to really control the narrative and all of that. But one of the things that they've really gotten the public to really understand, or at least believe, is this idea that yes, the Republican Party used to be the party of Lincoln, and the Democratic Party used to be the party of the KKK, but then somewhere around the 60s or 70s, it switched. And all of a sudden, the Republicans became the racists, and the Democrats became the party of the minority. What's the reality when it comes to that sort of thinking?
Well, I think it was Lyndon Johnson, and I think this comes out in some of the Dinesh D'Souza movies that he's made. I guess he's coming out with another one in August. I just learned today, but it has to do with the Great Society and basically getting a whole generation of people, by and large, addicted to social programs. And if you can do that, then they'll vote for whoever's increasing those programs every single time. And so it was a genius move, politically, but it largely destroyed, I believe, an entire people group in our country. Because after all, why should I get married when I can just continue to have kids out of wedlock and the government keeps giving me more and more money, each additional child I have. So it gives you no incentive to live according to the rules of society, work hard, and to get ahead. And so ever since that point in time, for whatever reason, one racial group in the United States thinks the Republicans are out to get them, because Republicans historically have been against some of these great society programs, but the Democrats are there to help them. And historically, that hasn't been the case. It was the Democrats that gave us the Jim Crow South and also the KKK, and it was the Lincoln Republicans that actually freed the slaves. But because as you go down through the course of time, 1950, 1960, the Republicans haven't wanted the Great Society, same way the Democrats wanted it. The narrative got flipped, and they think that it's the Democrats that are their friends and the Republicans that are their enemies, when historically the opposite is true. And in fact, the very programs that you're receiving money from are destroying the family structure, within your own group and people. So, it's a tragic thing that's happened, and I'm not the best person to talk about it because, well, there goes Whitey again. You have a white man's perspective, but there are, some extremely articulate voices, African American voices that'll tell people the exact same thing, and their words have more effect than mine would have, and yours would have.
Right. Well, and I think that's also an important thing that I think that we also need to understand as well, is that oftentimes, almost all the time, when the left are using a particular word or phrase or something like that, they're using it because that's something that should be unifying, but then they change the meaning or they change the definition or something like that. And that's one of those things with like Black Lives Matter, I think, is, Black Lives Matter should be a unifying statement in the sense of, like, nobody's going to deny that Black Lives Matter. But right. The thing is that when you actually look at the stated platform of BLM on their actual website, I mean, that's some stuff that's like anti-God, anti-Christian ideology, trying to completely dismantle everything it is that we stand for and believe in. And I think that's really the dangerous part of Christians supporting a movement like that.
Yeah, it's like Planned Parenthood. I mean, what a innocuous sounding name. But when you actually get into what they want, abortion on demand, government subsidized, and how they intentionally go into black areas to eradicate the black race. And that comes right out of the mouth of Margaret Sanger, who made, basically racist statements about blacks, called them weeds and, all of these kinds of things. And actually, if the photos aren't lying to me, I've seen some photos of her making speech, assuming it's not a doctored photo. This day and age with all the internet stuff, you don't know if the photo's been doctored or not. But I've seen pictures of her, giving presentations in her day in front of Klan members that are, fully uniformed with sheets and everything else. So, how many people know that history? Most don't. And so they take something that's racist and, like what you just said, they put a new label on it, and people can't recognize it as racist. But Planned Parenthood is one of the most racist organizations that's ever existed. I'll tell you someone else that gets a free pass on this racism issue is Charles Darwin. You look at the title of his book, and most people don't even know the full title of it. The Origin of the Species is the title, and the subtitle that sometimes gets clipped out of editions is The Preservation of the Favored Races. Now, doesn't that sound a little racist? And it was Darwin that taught that whites are superior intellectually to blacks because whites have evolved further than blacks. Blacks are a little closer to the monkeys than whites are in terms of the evolutionary spectrum. And does that not constitute the philosophical basis for racism? In fact, when you watch the movie Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed by Ben Stein that came out a few years ago, probably about, 10, 15 years now, he makes the point that that's the same argument that Adolf Hitler used related to the Jews, that they were not as evolved as the Aryan race. Now, people like you and me who believe the Bible can't believe that, because we believe on page 1 that all beings, Genesis 1:27, regardless of race, bear God's image, and we don't believe in evolution. So everybody wants to tear down all these statues. How come they're not tearing down Charles Darwin's statue? How come they're not tearing down the racist underpinnings of the Democratic Party? How come Margaret Sanger, gets a free pass? Well, the reason all of those groups get a free pass is all of these people are not interested in tearing down racist history. They're interested in tearing down American history, because the whole goal is to topple an existing society and replace it with something else more akin to their own worldview, which would be, socialism, communism, and Marxism. And that can't happen unless you first develop in people a disdain for the culture that currently exists. And what better way to do that than to argue that the whole thing is a genocide culture from its roots?
Yeah, no, that's very true. I'm feeling like, kind of to a certain degree, we kind of need to start the hashtag, cancel Darwin, at this point.
Do it. I'll sign up for that.
There we go. Well, and I think the interesting thing is that, what's really crazy to me is how, Christianity often gets painted as a bunch of like white supremacists, like we're out of touch from the black community and all that kind of stuff. But at the same time, like you were explaining in Genesis, it's like, we believe that we're all equal because we were all created at the exact same time. We see in the New Testament, Paul was writing, I believe, there's neither Jew nor Greek. We're all one in Christ. Like it's literally written into the Word of God. That we should not be, that there is no such thing as racism in the sense of like there's no different classes, there's no different hierarchy, anything like that. But for whatever reason, the left has been able to control the narrative, and even within the evangelical circles, and that to me is the really scary thing.
Yeah, there's a book, you can find it online. It's called The Bible Against Slavery. And it was written during the slavery era, and it was written by a biblicist, and he was using Bible verses, to argue against slavery. And I don't know, it's like our whole history as Christian abolitionists against slavery has been wiped out. I mean, I guess people have never heard of William Wilberforce. There's even a movie about William Wilberforce and how William Wilberforce used his position in Parliament as an evangelical Christian to argue against the slave trade. And it's a story of his perseverance after being defeated legislatively several times. Towards the end there, he finally got the thing abolished. And he spent his life trying to do this because of his understanding, of the Bible. And I know that there's, I can't remember the fellow's name. It'll come to me in a second. But, there's certain Bible versions where they argue, that the black race is let's see, his last name is Dake. Jennings Finnis Dake or Finnis Jennings Dake, one of the two. Dake Study Bible. And there's some good stuff in that Bible, but unfortunately, he argues there, that the black race was the cursed race of Ham and all of that stuff. By the way, that came out in the movie Mississippi Burning. If you ever saw that. And so people think, well, if you believe the Bible, that somehow you're in favor of slavery. Well, that's not historically what biblicists have believed, like William Wilberforce. And, even beyond that, everybody would acknowledge that what Dake was doing there, with the cursed race of Ham is a perversion of what the biblical text says. I mean, if you want to know what the Bible says, it says all of us are made in God's image. No color, different pigmentation in the skin is more highly evolved than another. That's anti-biblical. So everywhere the Bible has gone, it's always put into the ground the seeds that would destroy the institution of slavery. People always say, well, Paul says, slaves submit to your masters. Well, let's think about that for a minute. I mean, that was the culture of the day. Paul wasn't advocating that. He was saying this is a cultural reality, and here's how you're to act in the midst of it. And I think Paul, in the back of his mind, understood that the more his message went out, the more the philosophy would be put in place that would destroy that institution, one day.
Yeah. Well,
I mean, if you look at how Paul does things, like in Acts 19, when he goes into Ephesus and there's the idol makers there, he doesn't go on a campaign against the idol makers. He doesn't start a boycott. What he does is he spreads the gospel, and people get saved in droves. You can see it all in Acts 19 on his third missionary journey. He was in Ephesus, I think, around 3 years. Only two of the three in the school of Tyrannus teaching. But he was there for 3 years, and all these people started getting saved. And as they got saved, guess what they didn't want anymore? They didn't want their idols. And so he indirectly drove them out of business. And I think that's Paul's thought pattern on slavery. I think he knows that as the gospel gets spread, the institution would become obsolete. But Paul did say, slaves, submit to your masters. And I just want to make the point that he wasn't advocating slavery. He was just acknowledging its cultural reality. And I think in the back of his mind, he knew that it was antithetical to biblical truth and it would be destroyed one day.
Yeah, well,
in Christian civilizations,
right, absolutely, and I think that one of the other aspects when it comes to slavery in the Bible and things along those lines, especially when you're dealing with the Old Testament, when you're dealing with like Leviticus and they're describing the laws regarding it. The interesting thing there was that obviously there was the after, I believe it was after 6 years or after 7 years that you could actually be freed unless you chose to stay on for the rest of your life. But the other side of it is that it wasn't rooted in racism. And I think that's what makes what was happening here in America so distinct, and why it was so important that we abolish it, was because it was rooted in this racist ideology that viewed African Americans as less than. And I think that that's something that was not present in Old Testament Israel. That was more like people that were arrested during, or captured during war. That was people that were looking for a place to stay and food and lodging, and it was essentially you're working for somebody kind of a thing. And I think that as Christians we kind of have to figure out, okay, how do we differentiate between the evils that we had here in America with slavery versus what was described in the Old Testament?
Yeah, that's a good point. And if people want to dogpile on the law of Moses, those verses you referenced there in Leviticus, then it's not a fair discussion unless you compare it to another legal code of that time period, which is the Code of Hammurabi, which preceded the law of Moses by, I don't know, probably around 400 years. It was a relatively contemporary legal code, and look at that legal code's respect for human rights, compared to what you find in the law of Moses. For example, the law of Moses talks about you don't punish somebody for a crime without 2 to 3 witnesses. Well, look at the Code of Hammurabi. Code of Hammurabi says if you want to figure out if someone is guilty, then you throw them into a river. And if they drowned, they were guilty. If they survived, then they were innocent. So, you want to start trashing the law of Moses as anti-humanitarian. Fine, let's have the discussion, but let's contemporize it, or put it in its proper historical context, I should say. And let's compare, the Code of Hammurabi to the law of Moses, and you'll see an extremely elevated view of human rights in the Mosaic Law compared to the pagan legal codes, from that time period. And then another thing, you mentioned America, the origins of slavery. I mean, my goodness, did the United States invent slavery? Slavery has been going on since the dawn of human history. I mean, go back into the Bible. It was the Jews, that were enslaved for 400 years, which is an awful long time. That's double the length of the United States, roughly. They were enslaved for 400 years, the Jews were, to the Egyptians. And every race has been enslaved by somebody. I think it was Thomas Sowell that says every race has been involved in slavery or been subjected to slavery at some particular time. So slavery was something that was going on in Europe. And when our forebears came to this country, they brought a lot of that with them. But it's interesting that when you get to the Declaration of Independence, and we declared our independence from Britain, what you discover is, and I was sort of shocked to learn this, that 3/4 of our founding fathers were against slavery. 1/4 was in favor of it. And a lot of them set up, anti-slavery societies or abolition societies. And so I think all that's important to bring up, because a lot of people think, I think it was Kane, the guy that was VP,
Yeah, Tim
candidate
Kaine,
with Hillary, I guess, right?
Yep.
Last time around, he said on the Senate floor that slavery, was invented and created completely in the United States. And I can't think of a more, ignorant, uneducated, anti-historical thing to say from an elective representative, someone that was one heartbeat away almost from the presidency. Had they won, then that kind of statement. I mean, that's just absurd to say that. America did not invent slavery. She inherited slavery. And once she declared her independence, a lot of our founding fathers, in fact, the vast majority of them, were against slavery. But they couldn't win that one, because if they insisted on that, the Constitution would have never been ratified. So they kicked the can down the road and let a subsequent generation handle the issue, and history proved them right. Because the Civil War generation, and the post-Civil War amendments to our Constitution, the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, fixed the problem.
Yeah. Well, and when you think about it too, slavery was abolished less than 100 years after the founding of our country. So I mean that in and of itself is probably the fastest that any country or any society has ever abolished slavery altogether, between the founding and actually getting rid of it altogether.
And not only that, it's going on today in Islamic parts of the world. So how come Black Lives Matter is not boycotting, these countries where slavery still exists. I mean, why are they trashing all of the time the country that actually did something about it? Well, the issue is I think it was Curtis Bowers. You know Curtis Bowers,
Yep.
don't you? He talks against communism. In one of his talks, he says the issue is never the issue. The issue is the revolution. In other words, the Marxists will exploit any issue they have to exploit to achieve their greater aim of one world communism. So they really don't care about race. What they care about is using the issue of race to spread communism. And it's like feminism. They don't care about women's rights either. If they cared about women's rights, they'd be speaking against Islamic countries that are abusing women in a horrific sense right now as we speak. What they really and if they really cared about feminism, they would be going after Bill Clinton. Who Bill Clinton comes in the room. Grab your daughters and wife. Get them away from the molester, Bill Clinton. I mean, how come Bill Clinton is never called to account for his trashing of women? Why are they so silent? Well, anybody with two brain cells to rub together can see that they don't really care about that issue. They care about exploiting the issue selectively to topple an existing country and replace it with Marxism. And I wish more people were doing broadcasts like we're doing right now.
Yeah.
So they could see the truth of this stuff.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. That's the thing that's so vitally important, I think, is to be able to have a lot of these kind of conversations and get beyond just the headlines. Because I feel like everybody's just dealing with like the headline that they see on CNN or on Twitter or whatever it is, and nobody's actually reading the article. Nobody's actually going to looking at the history and the context and even the Bible and what it says about it. And that's why a lot of this kind of stuff is so important. And speaking of headlines too, one of the other ones I wanted to talk to you about was the Supreme Court case more recently, especially dealing with LGBTQ issues. And I believe it was dealing specifically with discrimination and hiring and firing practices and things along those lines. I know I've been seeing a lot of Christians have been saying that it's extremely concerning because now it's essentially a persecution against Christians, Christian business owners, even Christian organizations potentially. What's kind of your response to how that all played out with that Supreme Court case?
Well, I mean, this is an issue that's been going on for the last 45 years. And it really has to do with civil rights. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, which everybody agrees with. You should not discriminate against people, based on some immutable characteristic about themselves. So to qualify for civil rights protection, historically, you've had to demonstrate 4 characteristics. Number 1, you have an unchangeable characteristic about yourself, like gender or skin color or something like that. Number 2, there's a historical pattern of discrimination against you. Women can easily demonstrate that. Blacks in America can easily demonstrate that, etc. Number 3, the characteristic, is such that it can't be harmful. It's something that the legal system would call innocuous. And I had a 4th characteristic there somewhere, but I can't remember it off the top of my head. But you get the gist. And so the issue is, well, does sexual orientation and transgenderism fit within that historical standard? And we've been debating that for 45 years. And right now they haven't been able to legislatively change the law because they haven't been able to convince everyone that transgenderism and sexual orientation fits the standards of immutability, innocuousness, a historical pattern of discrimination. In fact, the average homosexual couple makes an income almost double that, of a heterosexual couple. And so there's no great discrimination against homosexuals in this culture, at all. In fact, homosexuals are probably some of the most affluent members of society. And think about it, when you have two men in a relationship, a man typically has a higher earning power than a woman, and you don't have any costs for kids or diapers or college tuition. I mean, of course there's tremendous affluence in the homosexual lifestyle. So the homosexual lifestyle doesn't fit the civil rights categories. Even beyond that, there's a big debate on if you're homosexual. I mean, let me put it this way. I know people that are ex-homosexuals. In fact, Paul talks about them in 1 Corinthians 6, verses 9 through 11. He talks about homosexuality, and he said, such as some of you were. So you can be changed, just like I can be changed from overeating or an anger problem or any other behavior. So homosexuality doesn't fit the standards of civil rights criteria. And that's what everybody's been debating for 45 years. So all of a sudden the Supreme Court out of the clear blue, and what you have to understand about the Supreme Court is you only need 5 votes for a majority opinion. And because they're appointed for life, you can't vote them out, if you disagree with them. So they are a branch of government that really shouldn't be there rewriting laws. They should be interpreting what the Constitution says and applying it. And they didn't do that here. In the case that came down, what was it, last week? Bostock versus Clayton County. They looked at that 1964 statute that everybody's been arguing about for 45 years, and they just rewrote it. They ended the debate. And when they do that, then I can't have a say in it. You can't have a say in it. It's completely taken out of our hands. And so it's tyrannical, what they just did. And it was the 4, there's a block of them on there that always vote liberal, 4 of them. And they need a Republican swing vote or turncoat or Benedict Arnold, I will put it that way. And they talked Gorsuch into it along with Roberts. Roberts has given some terrible opinions already. He's the one that upheld Obamacare. So those two flipped over and voted with the 4-person liberal voting bloc, a 6-3 decision, and they just rewrote the law. And most evangelical Christians hardly even know what just happened. But once you make sexual orientation and transgenderism, give them the same status as civil rights protection. I mean, look at the lawsuits that can happen against Christian businesses, Christian colleges. We don't want to hire a cross-dresser. Sorry. Oh, well, you've got yourself in legal trouble now, because that's the equivalent now of saying, I don't want to hire you because you're black. So it really opens up Pandora's box. And the rioting is going to be over soon, I hope. And Trump, even if he gets a second term, won't be there forever. And the COVID-19 thing is going to go away, I hope. But this issue will never go away. And I'm trying to explain why. So it's terrible. It's probably the worst decision we've ever had since Roe versus Wade, which did the same thing. The court weighed in on a controversial issue and took it out of the hands of the electorate. And they did it as an unelected, life-tenured member of the federal judiciary. By the way, the Federalist Paper number 78, calls the judicial branch of government the least dangerous branch, because it was always assumed that they were just going to interpret the Constitution as it was originally written. And that's why they had no problem appointing them for life. And over the course of time, because now they see themselves as amenders of the Constitution without being accountable to the people, they've become the most dangerous branch of government. And so, sorry for the loquaciousness there of my answer, but you keep asking these questions that I've been stewing on for a while.
Yeah, no, I mean that's the whole point of this show, is to kind of dive into a lot of this kind of stuff, and I think for me too, looking at looking at that court decision, the thing is that what it really comes down to, are you an originalist or are you not? And I think that's really the deciding factor with a lot of this kind of stuff, because I don't think anybody could make the argument that in 1964 they were specifically looking to protect those within the homosexual community from being discriminated against by a business. That was not the original intent.
Right.
And so, like you were saying, they're projecting into that law something that it was never intended to be. And again, like you were saying, that's the dangerous aspect of this. So then it's okay. So now what? Is there any recourse? Is there anything that Christians can or should be doing in response? Anything that conservative states can be doing in response? How do we fix this mess that we find ourselves in?
Well, you can't. It's a done deal. It's over. And that's why I say I think we just lost the culture war. I mean, I wouldn't have any problem if people wanted to amend the statute to include these other behaviors that don't fit the traditional criteria. I guess I could live with it if we actually had a debate about it, where I could give my 2 cents and other people could give their 2 cents, and we could just have it out. We've had that for 45 years, and their side hasn't been able to prevail. So what they did this time is they just usurped the will of the people and rewrote the statute anyway. And, Trump has been, and everybody gets mad at me when I say this because it's an election year and we all need to get behind Trump. And I'm a Trump voter. I hope he gets a second term. But here's the deal. Trump told us he was going to put originalists on the Supreme Court. And he put this guy, Neil Gorsuch, on there. A lot of us had concerns about Neil Gorsuch when he was nominated, because Neil Gorsuch in Boulder, Colorado, was a member of a very pro-homosexual, very liberal, pro-LGBTQ Episcopalian church. And there happened to have been another more conservative Episcopalian church in town that he could have attended. He didn't attend that. He supported this liberal church with his time and his money. I think he was an usher in that particular church. So that in and of itself raised some suspicions in a lot of us. And we were just told to shut up, go to the back of the bus. What are you trying to do, elect Hillary? And so this guy was really never vetted. And we all got to get behind Trump, and this is his first pick. And so we all bought the propaganda. And lo and behold, when this issue comes up, the opinion that just came out a couple weeks ago, he jumps ship and sides with the liberal voting bloc and changes civil rights in the United States, with the stroke of a pen. So, from that standpoint, you can't do anything about it unless somebody wants to fix the Supreme Court. And there's actually a way to do it. In the Constitution, the Congress, if they wanted to, could limit the original jurisdiction of the Supreme Court, meaning they could tell them, you can't hear any more civil rights cases like this. You can't hear any more abortion cases like this. The Congress, if they wanted to, could decrease membership to the Supreme Court, increase membership to the Supreme Court, take away their retirement benefits. Do you think that would get their attention? I think it would. Everybody's upset about the Ninth Circuit. Congress could abolish the Ninth Circuit if they wanted to. And people say, well, how could that happen with Nancy Pelosi running the House of Representatives? Well, keep in mind that Nancy Pelosi was not running the House of Representatives during the first 2 years of the Trump administration. And in Republican hands, our Congress did absolutely nothing about this issue. You know why they didn't do anything about this issue? Because if you fix the problem, you lose the campaign issue.
Yep.
And what they do is they line us evangelical Christians up every single election cycle by saying, gosh, the Supreme Court's going to go to hell in a handbasket if those Democrats get in there. And if they had fixed the problem, they would lose the campaign issue. So there actually is a way to fix this. The problem is either on the Democrat side or the Republican side, we don't have anybody with a legislative will to fix it. And I'll tell you, the guy that explained all this to me, I had lunch with him, and he wrote a book about it, was Tom DeLay. Tom DeLay is from our area, so I had a chance to eat lunch with him and get into a discussion with him about the Supreme Court. And he's the guy that really told me about this. In I think it's Article 3, it says that. And so there's a way to fix it. The problem is we don't have anybody on either side of the aisle with the legislative will to fix it. And so what can you do about it if nobody wants to fix the problem? Well, you're stuck living in this oligarchy. The Greek word oligos is few. Oligarchy means ruled by a few people. And that's exactly what Gorsuch and Roberts and the 4 liberal members of the court just did to us. They just usurped the legislative function, which, by the way, the Federalist Paper number 47 calls that tyranny when that happens. So we're already in the form of an oligarchical, soft form of tyranny. And, I would just say, what do we do about it? You can't do anything about it unless you get people in the House of Representatives that want to assert their power and curtail the original jurisdiction of the U.S. Supreme Court and start abolishing lower wayward federal courts.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing that, like I've been saying for quite a while, is that I think that what you were saying about how nobody actually wants to fix the problem has been, in all reality, why I think somebody like Trump has gotten a lot of blowback, is because with a lot of these different issues, he came in as like, well, hey, I'm just going to fix the problem. And Republicans and Democrats are like, whoa, wait a second, we need something to campaign on. Like, nobody actually wanted to fix the immigration system. They just wanted something to run on. And then all of a sudden he's going to be like, nope, I'm going to build a wall. And then everybody's like, you can't do that, because now what are we going to campaign on? And so I think that that's something that we need to remember about politics in general, is that they don't actually care about fixing it. They just care about their reelection or raising money.
Well, the immigration issue, mainstream Republicans love illegal immigration just like Democrats, because to Democrats it's more votes. To Republicans, it's cheap labor for our businesses. And so as long as you're dealing with establishment party types, no one will ever fix immigration. And then Trump comes along, and he's a non-establishment guy, and he's independently wealthy, where he's not dependent upon George Soros or whoever to get reelected, and he just wants to do what's right for the American people. And that's why everybody likes him. That's why I like him and voted for him, even though I thought the Gorsuch thing could have been handled, as I tried to explain earlier, a little better. So Donald Trump is an anti-globalist. Donald Trump would be loved by everybody if he campaigned on, let's make the world a better place, or let's make the world great again. But he did not do that. He says, let's make America great again. And he's got the resources to make good on his promises because he doesn't need their money. And you're right. He made a lot of decisions that went in the best interest of the country. And so the establishment types hate his guts because of it, because they don't want the problems fixed. Because once they get fixed, then you lose the campaign issue. Yep. And I agree with you 110%.
Yeah. And again, it's one of those things where I think as people who did support Trump and do at the same time, we also have, it's not that he does everything right, because I think that these Supreme Court decisions have shown that, he can definitely do better in picking injustices, and maybe there's too many people talking in his ear and that sort of thing. So I think, as Christians and as conservatives, we can't get so caught up in the man. We got to get focused on the issues and take it issue by issue kind of a thing.
Absolutely. I'm actually trying to write a little book right now. It's part of a sermon series that I did in 2016 before the last presidential election, and it's called The Bible and Voting. And when I gave that sermon series at our church, it ran about 14 weeks. I basically said, look, in this series, you're not going to hear me say Republican or Democrat, Trump or Hillary. This is a Bible study, and we're going to do a topical study on voting. In other words, when you vote for anybody, even if it's for dog catcher, you ought to be screening that person through the lens of your biblical worldview. And so I divided it up into economic issues, the cultural, social issues, and then issues related to national defense, trying to show people that God has spoken on these things. And by the way, when God speaks on these things, his word is just as inspired as it is when he talks about how to get to heaven. John 3:16. I mean, that's inspired by God, but when he speaks on political things, that's inspired as well. And the Bible is not primarily a political textbook, but it does brush on political things, just like the Bible's not primarily set up as a scientific textbook or archaeological textbook or history textbook, but it does brush, or geography, but it does brush on those issues. And every time it speaks, it's just as inspired and inerrant and authoritative there as it is anywhere else. So I wish that's what people looked at when they went to vote. I mean, basically, some of the statistics I've read is half of the evangelical world is registered to vote. And then of that number that are registered, half of those actually do vote. And then of those that actually do vote, they're really not looking to the Bible as their authority. They look to, how did my parents vote, or is my business going to get this new government contract, or what tax bracket I'm going to be in, or some kind of self-serving end. And I just think the whole country would be different if we showed up every single election looking at God's word, not waiting for Jesus to show up because he's not on the ballot. So we have to, as much as people don't like to hear this, you have to pick from the lesser of evils because we're dealing with fallen human beings. And so which of these candidates actually lines up with God's priorities? And if everybody that names the name of Christ did that, first of all, registered and showed up and did that, I think the whole country would be different today. Mm-hmm. I think the whole country still could be transformed.
Yeah.
And we're doing it to ourselves just by not taking advice like we're dispensing here.
Yeah. Well, and it's kind of funny too, like when it comes, like everybody always says, like, don't vote for the lesser of two evils and that sort of thing. I always say it's not about the lesser two evils. It's who's closer to God's word, because nobody's actually going to be perfect. It's just which person is going to be closest to God's word. So from that perspective, it's just a different frame of thinking and that sort of thing. One thing that I always like to do is, kind of leave everybody with something practical. So because a lot of times we get into these philosophical, theological discussions and all that kind of stuff. And so do you have any recommended resources or anything like that for people to be, reading or studying up on a lot of this kind of stuff and things that they can kind of take and, use as a springboard for more study and that sort of thing?
Well, I've got that sermon series on our website, Sugarland Bible Church, if they're interested in it. I think one of the most important things a Christian could do right now is to understand history. Because I believe America is sort of in the throes right now, the infant stages of what I think is coming, a communist revolution. And I believe it was Karl Marx who said, a people that don't know their history are easily persuaded. And there's a reason why all these guys are running around trashing and vandalizing, all of these historical monuments and things. And so the better you know the Christian roots of the United States, the less likely you are to be duped. And so there's a lot of good books out there. I'm thinking of The Light and the Glory by the former Senate chaplain. His name escapes me, but The Light and the Glory is very good. I noticed Brandon House has had Bill Federer on recently. I've been reading Bill Federer's stuff for years. He talks a lot about, the Christian roots of America. I realize David Barton has, some issues theologically, but I think his book, Original Intent, is very well done and very well footnoted. A lot of people were sort of down on his book, The Jefferson Lies. I read that book. I found it to be very helpful. Gary Demar, who I don't like in the area of eschatology, because he is a dispensationalist hater, for lack of a better phrase. But he's written some very good, he's basically a preterist, anti-Israel reconstructionist. However, he has written some very, very valuable stuff on American history. He's got the God and Government series. So there's a lot of stuff out there that's available for folks just to sort of Tim LaHaye, of all people. It's funny, Gary DeMar is always accusing Tim LaHaye of neutralizing Christians in the area of politics through his Left Behind series. But one of the first Tim LaHaye books I ever read was called The Faith of Our Founding Fathers, which is another really good book showing the historical Christian roots of the United States. I'm just of the view that the more Christians sort of enmesh themselves in that, the less likely they are to be deceived. The book of Amos talks about a plumb line. Amos 7, verses 7 and 8. God says to Amos, "What do you see?" "I see a plumb line." A plumb line was basically a line that was always straight, I think because it was weighted at the bottom. So the plumb line would always be straight. And so you could hold the plumb line up to anything to ascertain whether it was built right or not. So you can figure out if any house or foundation or building was constructed in a faulty manner just by comparing it to the plumb line. The American history and the writings of our founding fathers, rightly understood, is the plumb line. You cannot understand if things are crooked unless you understand the plumb line. And so the more you can enmesh yourself in the Christian roots of the United States, the more you won't be swept into, the coming communist revolution in America.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Now, if people want to be following you and, follow everything that you're working on and that sort of thing, what are the best ways for people to be able to do that?
Well, probably the easiest way is my YouTube channel. We upload all of our recent teaching on there. We've got about over 500 and something videos on there. And you just type in Andy Woods into your YouTube search engine and maybe Pastor's Point of View, and it'll come up. You can go to our church website where you can get all of our teaching archives going back to 2014. Sugarland Bible Church, www.slbc.org. And you can also go to my personal website, www.andywoodsministries.org. I've got a really sharp guy helping me put together an app at the present time. It's not yet completed, but we're hoping to get that completed in the near future. So just keep your eye on the App Store, Andy Woods Ministries. It should be there. We're hoping fairly soon. And I guess those are the easiest ways to keep up with what I'm doing.
Very cool. Well, Andy, I always appreciate having on, and and every time I feel like we always dive into something, and it goes deep, and we dive into the issues. It's always fun. So
yeah, we might get thrown in jail for this one. I don't know.
You never know. In today's day and age, I wouldn't be surprised.
maybe they'll give us adjacent cells.
Hey, that'll work. We'll do a conversations with Jeff that way. So that sounds good.
There we go.
All right. Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. We'll definitely do it again sometime. And then for everybody else that's watching as well, make sure you guys like, subscribe, all of that as well. For more information, you guys can go to gatekeepersonline.com. We're posting articles, podcasts, all that kind of stuff. And also for everybody that's watching as well, we recently added on Bobby Lopez. He's got a new show, The Big Brown Gadfly. Definitely check that out. Really fascinating stuff dealing with a lot of the current events and all of that. So I highly recommend that one. And then, we shall see you guys next time.